Hey. All right. Yeah, it would help if I had unmuted. Sorry, folks.
That health lower left hand corner.
That's better. Awesome.
Lower left
All
hand
right.
corner.
That's Daniel's computer,
Okay.
not the host.
Yeah. So yeah, after the slides, I will show some of the devices that I brought with me. I brought a whole IoT network with me that I can control locally right here. Um, and we'll do kind of a little live demo. And we've already been joking about how that's not going to go well, but I think it will. I have to OK to being recorded and then reshare. So 1 second.
There we go.
All right. So yeah, what will you need? You'll need a local server. It could be an old laptop or it could be some purpose specific hardware. Um, it's highly recommended that you put all of your IoT devices on a dedicated network segment. One, if you get into the hundreds of devices, which I use a lot of really cheap stuff, so that's easier to do than you would think. Um, your Wi-Fi or whatever RF you're using is going to get clogged pretty quickly. The other thing is when you want to open this up to untrusted devices, or you want to be able to control this remotely from the internet. Um, there's a little bit of risk there. So you, just having that on a separate network segment entirely just simplifies the whole thing. So additionally, you're going to need local capable IoT devices. I brought a bunch of those here that we're going to get more into. Um, some of the devices that you already have, even if they are cloud connected today, they may be local capable. So we're gonna jump into that a bit too. Um, Depending on the device, you may need to do some soldering. It's nothing major. It's 4 or 5 wires. It's something that if you're not already familiar with doing, it's probably something you could learn pretty quickly. Additionally, a serial programmer. So these are pretty cheap. It's just a USB port with some wires that you'll connect to the device to flash firmware, and then the knowledge or bravery to work on 120 volts. So again, that's device dependent. But if you really want to make your like light switches and your walls smart, really cheap, you either have to have the knowledge to turn the breaker off or the bravery to deal with the consequences. Your choice. All right. So the way in which I have um, the way in which I have what's the best way to word this
Implemented.
implemented. Thank you. All of the local control is using Home Assistant. There are some other options that are open source. I think Habitat is one. Um, does anyone in here already use Home Assistant or a competing product? Okay. So figured we'd have a couple tonight. The nice thing about Home Assistant is wide hardware support. Like I said, you can run it on a laptop or a Raspberry Pi or put it in a Docker container. It's very flexible. When I first put this slideshow together back in February, they had about 2,200 integrations with various different IoT products. I updated that this week because they've added about 500 more. So they're about to top 3,000 devices. They're definitely not slowing down as far as like the number of products that they integrate with. The other nice thing that I like about Home Assistant is it can do local emulation of certain services. So this comes into play where it can emulate something like a Philips Hue Hub or Apple HomeKit, and you don't actually have to own any Apple hardware or Philips hardware. So that can help you with some of the integrations and automations with various products where you can kind of mix and match them. Yes, sir.
Can you explain that again? If I don't have that product, why would I want to emulate it?
We will get into that. Yep. So that aspect of it is very useful. Now, Home Assistant classifies the types of different connectivity to these devices into a few different things. So the most useful is going to be the local polling and local push. So that means that locally you're controlling it, and then local push is the best because that means that the device is telling Home Assistant, your hub, the status of it. So it tells automatically if the light turned on, if the switch is on, things like that. Whereas local polling would be Home Assistant is having to query over and over again, hey, is the light on? Is the light on? Is the light on? Trying to figure out that status. You can figure out what cloud polling and pushing is. It's the same thing, but with someone else's computer. And then assumed state is an interesting one. So one of the devices that I have here tonight works off of 433 megahertz RF, and it has no feedback loop. So when I send a signal to turn that on, there's nothing coming back saying it actually turned on. So that's the assumed state. Home Assistant will be assuming the device is on because we've told it to turn on, but there's no confirmation of that. So there's several different ways that you can control devices locally. Out of the box, very popular option is Z-Wave or Zigbee. If you have the money, Z-Wave is the way to go. But you may pay up to about $40 per light switch. It's not cheap. If you're wanting to put in a lot of devices, it's way too expensive. If you're wanting to cover even a small apartment, it's probably still going to be in over the $100 to $200 threshold. Zigbee is cheaper, but it's an open standard. It's not as reliable from what I've heard. I don't personally have any experience with it, but I've not heard the best things. Matter and Thread are some of the newest entries. This is what's supposed to bring all the different IoT companies together to work on the same protocol, like a standard for everyone. It's not quite working out just yet. There's still a lot of proprietary things going on, but we're getting there. Bluetooth can be local. I mean, it is, but depending on how a product has implemented it, you may not be able to use it locally, especially with something like Home Assistant. A good example of this is for my 20th work anniversary, I got one of the Amber mugs. It's a $150 mug. I would not recommend anybody ever spend $150 on a mug. It's ridiculous. But it is a good product, and I found that it uses Bluetooth to send out its status on the temperature and various things. It works with an app, but I don't want to have an app on my phone for every single IoT product that I use. I want it all centralized in my own hub. The Raspberry Pis include Bluetooth out of the box, plus you can get Bluetooth adapters. And fortunately, there was already somebody who created an open source integration with Home Assistant. So I was able to delete that app off of my phone and use Bluetooth with this new product locally. So that's where that's kind of local by default, kind of local by force. Now, Apple HomeKit. So you were asking a moment ago, how does that work if I don't have any Apple hardware? Well, Home Assistant will emulate a HomeKit hub, and it will look on my network like a HomeKit hub. So when I go to, say, like an Ecobee thermostat that supports Apple HomeKit, but I don't have any Apple products, I can hit the touchscreen options to trigger HomeKit integration, and then integrate that with this HomeKit emulation on Home Assistant, and the two will talk locally. Otherwise, I'm forced to use Echobee's cloud to control everything. So there's some ups and downs there, but we'll get into whether this is the right choice later on in the presentation. Another thing that I wanted to mention was Philips Hue. So Philips Hue, normally you get a Philips Hue hub, and it communicates over Wi-Fi or Ethernet to the outside world, but between the hub and the bulbs, it communicates over Zigbee. This device can emulate a Philips Hue hub, but not for the purposes of like throwing the hub away and communicating directly with the devices. It's not that. It's for well, you can use it for a few different things, but the main thing that I found it useful for is if you do emulate or integrate Amazon Alexa into your smart home, and I think you can do it with Google Home as well, but within that, they can control Philips Hue devices locally. So the nice thing is I can tell my Echo, like, Alexa, turn off the light. I don't have a Philips Hue light, but Alexa thinks that I have a Philips Hue hub because I'm emulating one on my Raspberry Pi, and then it receives that command to turn on or off the light and then sends it to whatever device I'm actually controlling. So emulations can work in a lot of interesting ways. Another local by default is just generic RF radio frequency. So I've got these plugs here that work over 433 megahertz using just a wireless remote, but you can record those signals with some very cheap, $1 to $2 hardware. You can record those and play those back, and basically throw the remote away, or keep it only for when needed. The last thing I'll mention on this slide is local by force Wi-Fi. So most of your cheap IoT devices that work over Wi-Fi are communicating to the cloud or somebody's server. You're controlling it through some app. You're going to have a different app for all these different products. And the majority of what I've done in my own smart home is take a lot of those devices and flash them with a open source firmware to be able to control those locally. So we'll get more into that. So speaking of the open source firmwares, there's two popular ones out there, Tasmota and ESP Home. And this is the part where I'm specifically glad that Wesley is not here, because he's a huge fan of ESP Home. And there's nothing wrong with ESP Home, except for it does take a lot of resources. But Tasmota is what I've used just because it's been around a lot longer. It's a little more basic. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it does what I need to do. And it's very low overhead. For the purposes of what I use it for, they both support MQTT, which is just a protocol that lets these devices communicate with Home Assistant. The other thing is ESP Home does have a few benefits if you have like Raspberry Pi Picos or some of these other non-ESP chipsets, which is kind of an edge case. I don't know how many people actually use those. One ESP Home feature that has came out in the last year or so is Bluetooth bridging, and now that I've got this fancy coffee mug that I just mentioned, I might actually start using ESP Home for that feature, because while I'm sitting at my desk and I can, see the stats on my coffee mug, which is totally a first world problem. Like, who really needs to do that? But if it's downstairs, the Bluetooth doesn't reach that far, and that's where ESP Home's Bluetooth bridge can come in. You can have, an ESP32 flashed with ESP Home, and it serves as a bridge, so it will broadcast and receive Bluetooth in a different part of the house and send those updates over Wi-Fi back to Home Assistant. Yeah, more memes. So where we're going, we don't need someone else's computer. All right, so now I'm going to start getting into some of the devices that I've used. This particular one that's on the screen is a Sonoff S31. This is a extremely useful, extremely versatile device. This is a smart plug that goes for about $11 to $15, depending on whether you can find it on sale and how many you buy at once. But here on the screen, we've got the plastic kind of torn off and some wires connected to it. So this is an example of taking a device that's supposed to be used with someone's app, and you can take, a cheap serial programmer and solder these wires on temporarily for a few minutes. Flash it with either Tasmota or ESP Home. They'll both work fine on this plug. And use it directly with Home Assistant. The nice thing about this plug is not only is it actually rated for 15 amps, whereas some of these other devices are a little more dangerous, it does power monitoring. So I wouldn't say it's the most accurate thing in the world, but it's probably going to be pretty good for most people's purposes. So yeah, if you want to plug this in a place that you don't access a lot, like a crawl space, and you've got a heat tape, you can plug this in, plug the heat tape into it, and then you can monitor in Home Assistant when it's using power. Is the thermostat in this heat tape actually cutting on at 25 degrees without having to crawl down there and see, hey, is the pipe frozen or not, kind of thing. So
one thing you might want to mention is the fact that you only have to pull out the wires one time and solder it one time. After that, you can update it over the air.
Yes, that great point. This is a one-time thing to flash the software on these. So if you buy a pack of 4 or 5, you can do them all in one night, and it might be a headache for a few hours until you get the hang of it. But then you never have to do that again.
Can you hear the relay make contact?
You can, yes. Now
In that device, not all of it.
This particular device, I don't have flashed for the network that I brought with me today. This is still configured for my home network, but still wanted to bring it and show it. I can pass it around if anybody cares. There's nothing too special about it.
Sorry.
So the next device here is the Sonoff Basic. So this was the first one that I got into and started flashing Tasmota on devices. This particular device only goes up to 10 amps, but you can see on the screen where the 4 or 5 different pins are. These images are really easy to find online on where you're supposed to connect these wires. The main thing is you do have to swap the TX and the RX, so the transmit and receive on one does not match transmit and receive on the other. So one transmits, one receives, same wire. But these particular devices, not only are they a little risky with not having the full 15 amps that some circuits in your house are probably pushing, but the traces on them, on the back side of this motherboard, are just big globs of solder. It just doesn't look like a very well-built device. Sonoff makes some better things like the plug I was just showing. I don't recommend this, but in a pinch, it works. You can cut an extension cord in half or a lamp cord and throw this in the middle of it. Anybody want to take a look at this one.
Sure, pass it around, baby.
For the transmit and receive, is that like a serial communications?
Yeah, it's RS-232. Well,
So
it's TTL actually, sorry.
I'm glad you were here. That some of the aspects that I just don't know.
My inner serial communication just popping in my head. It's like, what ball grade, right?
Showing your age.
Yeah.
Oh, I will pass around the programmer as well. Again, there's really nothing special about it. They sell 100 different kinds on Amazon and eBay.
The main thing on your programmer I'll bring to is these devices, a lot of them operate at 3.3 volts. Some of the programmers do both 5 volt and 3.3 volts, so make sure you have a compatible programmer.
Yep. And that one does have a jumper pin that you can change between 3.3 and 5. So
I was gonna ask about this exposed bed.
yeah. The next device I don't have with me because they're all in my walls right now, and I didn't want to take one out for tonight, but it's the Shelly One. So the Shelly One is very useful for putting in a wall behind your light switch. You can keep your existing light switch. So a year or two ago, I was using the Sonoff Basic as a smart light switch. So I would take the entire switch out of the wall and put that in and wire it up, knowing that it's probably not best, and my fire insurance would probably be void if anything bad happened. But these Shelly ones are rated for 15 amps. They are built to be put inside of these light switch boxes. The nice thing about these is you don't have to flash these. They support MQTT right out of the box. You can use their cloud if you want. You can use their app if you want, or you can just log in with over Wi-Fi and configure it with your own MQTT address within Home Assistant. So these are really nice as far as making existing switches smart. So the switch itself can stay there. Here's a diagram of it being wired up. And these are also pretty cheap. You can get them for about $15 a piece. So if you want to do Z-Wave, great. But 3 switches and you're at $120. Here I'm at like 45. So you can do a lot more with your budget this way. Questions so far?
The Shelly also makes a great garage door opener controller.
I'm using
24 volts AC.
I may be upgrading to that, but right now I'm using one of these. Right. Yeah. Speaking of which, so WeMOS D1 Mini. So this is a ESP 8266. The ESP32 is the more common one now. It's been out for a while. It can do a lot more. The 8266 might be a bit cheaper. This particular board is nice because it has built-in Wi-Fi and a lot of GPIO pins. So I am currently using this as a garage door opener that I can control remotely. The way to do that is to wire it up to a relay, which is about the same size as this board, and then it emulates the button press that you have on your wall. So it just clicks that relay closed for about a second, opens it back up, and the garage door thinks that a button was pressed.
Relay mean like mechanical, electromechanical relay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of these are relay based. So this, everything that I've passed around, and yeah, for my smart garage door opener, all use relays.
The GPIO, is that a digital or analog port?
Yes.
Can it do both?
Some microprocessors have analog to digital converters built in.
Yes.
Others
So
you have to use an external.
the green pin 2, or A0 on this is analog.
Okay.
All the D pins are digital. So.
Okay.
And the other nice thing is the WeMOS can put out both 3.3 volt and 5 volt. So I'll pass this around. And these chips are pretty cheap. I want to say around $5. I haven't
You
looked
go
in
to
a while.
AliExpress and buy them at 20 at a time. They're $1.50.
Oh, okay. So if you want to do IoT, you want to do a lot of IoT, and you want to do it cheap. This is the way to do it. This is how I got into it. All right. So tying all the pieces together, we're about to get into the demo, but first, just give a little bit of an overview. When you put it all together, it looks like a mess. You're going to have it connected to the internet because that's half the purpose. But I've got the Raspberry Pi here in the middle of this diagram, if you want to call it that, because it's handling all the different communications. So we've got Wi-Fi to various devices that I just mentioned. The Roomba I put in there because, in particular, Roomba uses MQTT. So you can put I wouldn't say most. You can put some Roombas into not a pairing mode or a debug mode, but you can put it in a special mode where it will give up its local password, and you can configure that within Home Assistant and get rid of that Roomba app. In my demo here, I've got my Raspberry Pi that I brought with me. This wire and very small circuit board hanging off of it are the 433 megahertz RF that I've added to it. The Pi has built-in Wi-Fi, built-in Bluetooth, so it handles that. If you wanted to use more modern protocols, Z-Wave, Zigbee, Matter, Thread, all of that, there are plenty of just USB adapters that you can plug in, and that's whether you're using a Pi or an old laptop or what have you. So it's kind of like Legos. You just keep building on it. So demo time. So now we find out if my shit works. So I've passed around these devices. Oh, here's a few more that I'll pass around. So here's some of the 433 megahertz transmitters, receivers. The smaller green one is a transmitter. The bigger one is a receiver. And then the blue one, I can't remember, but I think it's 315 megahertz. But those are, if you buy them in bulk, you can get them for less than $1.
Which one did the FBI?
That is
915
classified.
megahertz.
Okay.
Very nice.
So I'd mentioned that some of the plugs that I brought with me are supposed to be used with this remote, and I've added it to the Raspberry Pi. So here I'm going to get out my phone, which is on the same local network here. And if this works, that Christmas tree will come on
the desk.
There we go.
Yay.
So I've got now the off command did not work. Let me
That's
bring
nice.
the antenna up a little higher.
That's that assumed state.
That's the assumed state. There we go. Off and on. There we go.
Is that on one of those Sonos plugs?
That is on one of these. This is a Zap brand. I don't know. It's some no name. Oh, eTech City is the brand. They're not the most reliable thing, but if you already have something like that around your house, you can put it to good use. You can, reuse it without having to throw it away. You can bring your smart home, or you can bring your old devices into the IoT realm. The other thing that I brought with me was a Wi-Fi bulb. So, in addition, I've got another plug back there. I'm not going to toggle it because it's going to kill the bulb's power. But there's the light bulb. Now, this particular light bulb, it isn't just plugged into a smart outlet. It is a smart bulb itself. So it's running Tasmota itself. It's a color bulb, so you can change it to all the fancy colors and even make it way too bright.
So is that using Wi-Fi to communicate to that?
So
or-
that is using MQTT over Wi-Fi.
Okay.
And that is probably the most popular use case in my home is using MQTT over Wi-Fi for either bulbs or plugs or that in-wall switch. That in-wall switch can also be great for ceiling fans. You can lay in bed at night and say, Alexa, turn on the fan, and it just turns on. That's by far one of the most satisfying automations. What other devices do I have here? I believe that is it for the demo. I know we've had some devices passed around. What questions does everyone have about anything really? Devices, protocols, RF.
What's
So-
the,
Go ahead first.
what's the distance that you can use this?
So Wi-Fi is going to be limited based on both your Wi-Fi router and the device itself. So if it's inside of a wall, inside of a light switch, that's probably going to be a little bit less. But I've seen it work up to, I don't know. I haven't found a spot in my house that doesn't work for Wi-Fi. But then I've got a 2-node Wi-Fi mesh system. So I would say if your phone has good Wi-Fi next to the switch, you're probably going to be okay. The plastic cover that's over it isn't going to hinder it too much. It probably depends more on the number of walls between that spot and your router or access point.
Okay.
I have a question.
So let's assume like internet and soldering ignorant, like Mr. Pelfrey here.
Today, shots fired.
Where do I start? Like, my wife doesn't allow me to touch anything hot. So what would I start with if I wanted to like begin with something that would be cool but not complicated?
For that, if you've got a Raspberry Pi laying around or an old laptop, something that nobody else is using for or depending on, that's where you should start. Get Home Assistant on that, and then as far as like a device, I would say probably when you say hot, you mean like soldering hot?
Oh,
Or-
like AC.
no.
Or like
Soldering,
electrical current.
Using an iron.
Okay.
On a stove.
Okay.
You're a hazard, right?
Yeah.
Running with scissors.
But it'd be
I
good
feel
for-
like there's reasons.
It sounds like this would be a good starting with Christmas project because there's so many light and effect kind of things going on.
Yeah. Well, I would say probably some smart plugs. There may be some that you can buy that you don't necessarily have to open up to flash. I don't know how popular they are, but there was a method called Tuya Convert, TUYA, I believe, and you can flash those over Wi-Fi. You can convert them from the Tuya app to Tasmoda or ESP Home.
TUYA.
Yeah. So, check the Amazon reviews or whatever website you're buying it from. Surely there's a nerd there that's like, this works great with Tasmoda or ESP Home or to convert.
Your mileage may vary.
Yes. There are a few companies that are selling the devices with either Tasmoda or ESP Home already preloaded, which would be a great starting point as well.
Yeah.
Better to go and get that.
If you use different vendors,
Mhm.
do you recommend isolating them all? Like, so do you want them all to be in the same broadcast domain? The best practices.
I haven't had any problem with all of them being together on a separate IoT VLAN or Wi-Fi SSID.
As a follow-up to that, have you ever looked at how often these reach outside to something? Or what are they phoning home to?
I haven't specifically, but there has been a couple of devices that I have configured for Wi-Fi and then blocked their internet access. There was a cheap Chinese vacuum that my wife brought home, and as a vacuum, it's great. But I'm like, why does it need Wi-Fi? Like, I don't need to know that its battery is fully charged. Either, I use it and then I put it on the charger and it's either charged or it's not when I come to use it. Same argument could be said for the coffee cup that I mentioned. Like, it doesn't need to be smart. But yeah, I don't trust that device because of the brand being such a incredibly cheap knockoff brand. Even if they are not malicious, they probably didn't have the budget to put in proper security.
As a note, side note here, I've played around with embedded controllers for many, many years, and their basic support of networking is very minuscule, and you will find, oh, this thing has a hard-coded username and password that you can get into it via Telnet, right? It's like, wow, it's open. No, there's no encryption here. It's completely wide open. Or it has it's running a web server that is basically so easily knocked over from dozens of exploits that, if something were to communicate to this thing, this system is going to be owned very quickly.
Right. Yeah. For those, I would definitely stick with something that you can flash your own firmware on. That way, it may have some vulnerabilities, but the community should find them, hopefully before they're exploited on a wider scale.
Yes, sir. I already said this, but I was looking at, is this on the transmitter for 432 megahertz?
That one's the transmitter. That's the receiver.
What is this one?
I believe, I don't remember, but I've got some 315 megahertz devices. I think that might be one of them.
You see adjustable frequency? I see a little toggle on there.
Yeah, there is a screwdriver adjustment. I'm not sure what it's for. I bought the 315 megahertz devices for a project that didn't work out, and I haven't spent much time with them in the last few years. So I don't recall, unfortunately. Yes, sir.
Have you played with trying to integrate your own local voice assistant in versus an Alexa?
I am extremely interested in doing that, but I've been studying for a cert for the last year or so, and thought that I'll just let everybody else work out all the kinks in this, and then by the time I've got free time again, it'll be a lot easier to use. How about you? Have you tried it out?
I'm writing my own in Python. I couldn't get any of the existing to work.
Okay.
And it's a rabbit hole that you just bang your head against the whole way down.
So the Home Assistant, your voice has not helped you at all?
Yeah, I was about to mention that.
No, in fact, I was very hopeful when they said that it was going to be the Your Voice, and I think they overreached. They overreached.
Yeah.
I got some of the functionality to work. So I've got my Home Assistant set up, integrated with a Casa OS home hub that's looped back into itself, and a magic mirror that I try to send voice commands through and get a display. Instead of looking on my phone, the magic mirror to display what I needed to do.
Okay.
It's been a tough road, and I've got like 60-some% of it working the way I want. The other 40% is just I get into it and I get frustrated and stop, and then I don't come back to it.
That's what I assumed the state of it was. I think Year of the Voice was last year, like 2023. So we're most of the way through 2024, and I haven't seen any YouTube videos that's like, oh, it's so much easier now. And I guess we're all still kind of waiting for that state. But
I just gave up and started writing my own rudimentary in Python, and that's how I've gotten to the 60% mark. But it was still getting it integrated with so. The other part is I'm integrating it with Olama for my search function so that it doesn't use Google. Like my Olama is trained locally, so like I'm trying to keep everything local. It's on a network that doesn't have any external ports and can't talk to it.
Right.
So if it tries to hit the internet and requires internet functionality, it just falls on its face, and I know I've got to move on to something else.
right.
Something else I was going to ask was, are there any current or integrations with any of the local large language models? It sounds like that's what you're working on right now.
So,
Yeah, my goal is to be 100% local with
Yeah.
nothing reaching out for anything. I want it completely encapsulated. But it's been frustrating. Spousal approval factor would have probably been much higher had I gone with Alexa.
Right.
Like my smart plugs now, whenever they lose internet connectivity, start blinking.
right.
Or network connectivity, and they just start blinking. My wife will come and she's like,
Fix it now.
Yeah.
Right.
One of my coworkers complains every time he loses power, right? Everything, all the lights come on because it's all smart home-based stuff. So yeah, it depends on the order of operations of what stuff comes up first.
right, so mine runs in a Docker container ultimately.
Okay.
And so if the power goes down, it comes back up, and things don't come back up in the right order. The whole thing has to be redone from. I have to go reboot the machine and catch everything and things like that. It's a mess. It's obviously a DIY.
Right.
So but it sounds like you've had much more success integrating with Alexa and such. So.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into the very last slide, but I wanted to make sure there were no more questions before I jumped into it.
Oh my goodness. It's like the 15th.
I know, right?
That's impressive. That's what that is. All right, so the last slide is what is your risk appetite? So let's say you do want to do all this at home. You do want to do it all locally. You are inheriting a lot of responsibility. So it's great if you can be 100% local and you can pull out your phone or your own in-house voice assistant to control things. But eventually you're going to go outside your house and you're going to want to check on the status of those things or control them perhaps. So you're going to have to worry about perimeter security. So if you're opening up a website, whether it's on your Raspberry Pi or a bigger server cluster or what have you, that's a security risk. You've got to consider that. That's something that that you're either going to have to monitor, or something that you might decide that you want to push off on someone else. So Home Assistant does have a option to where you can use their cloud to remotely access your local network. Again, you have to put some trust in them. If they get hacked, then they can hack you. But it's going to be a lot easier and it's going to work a lot more simply. That service costs, I think, $5 a month the last I checked. Okay. I'd subscribed for a little while because it made the Alexa integration so much easier. But I'm since doing it myself again, and I'm using the Philips Hue emulation to do that. So I'm controlling things through Alexa. The voice part goes through the internet, but the command comes from one of the local speakers to Home Assistant over Wi-Fi saying, hey, turn on this Philips Hue bulb. Well, that Philips Hue bulb might be an EV car charger. It might be a ceiling fan. It could be anything as long as I configure it in Home Assistant to say, hey, emulate this as a Philips Hue device as far as Alexa or other things are concerned. But yeah, that you mentioned the spousal approval factor. Yeah. The ease of use or lack of having to troubleshoot something as simple as a light switch goes a long way. So that's also part of the risk appetite, being the availability of these things. So if you are replacing the simple functionality of a light switch and now it doesn't work like a light switch should, you got to think about what's that connected to. Is it a big deal if that quits working for some reason, if I mess something up, or if the device I put into the wall decides to die suddenly. So if it's a ceiling fan, not too big of a deal. It's more of a hassle, but a light, also not the end of the world. But like maybe you've hooked this up to a light switch that controls a fireplace. Now you're getting into a lot more serious hazards. Like what if you've turned it on, left the house, and you're like, oh, I forgot to turn it off. you go to turn it off, but it doesn't actually turn it off. You got to consider what responsibility you're taking on by moving all this stuff local. Additionally, you're going to have to think about vulnerabilities and patch management. So, Home Assistant hasn't had too many public CVEs or common vulnerabilities. I can only remember maybe one in the last couple of years, but the community does find those, and you're going to want to patch that as quickly as possible, since a large majority of users are going to have this exposed to the internet. Additionally, the devices that you're sticking in your walls or plugging into your outlets, they could also have vulnerabilities. So that may not be an internet threat. That might be like a neighbor in driving past your house or in the apartment above you, just being able to connect to that device wirelessly locally. And then from there, they could pivot into Home Assistant. And then depending on how your network is segmented, maybe they can pivot into the rest of your home network and start sniffing all of your traffic. So definitely a lot to consider. Another aspect of it is the data storage. So one thing that I forgot to add to my slides is cameras. So the little $25 Wise cameras that you all may have seen, the little square white ones that were popular for a few years, you can flash those with a firmware that enables RTSP, which is a local real-time streaming protocol. You can integrate those very easily with Home Assistant. You can quit using the Wise app. But where are you storing that video? Well, it's either stored on the SD card in the camera, or it's stored in Home Assistant or whatever you're streaming it to. If you go on vacation and somebody breaks into your house and they happen to steal whatever you're storing that video on, then all of your footage is gone. So some of these risks are not going to be worth the benefits of just being able to have the satisfaction that you own it, you control it, it's local, it's not on someone else's computer. Sometimes there will be a benefit to putting this stuff in the cloud. For example, I have Ring cameras in my house. I have a Ring alarm system. It's $100 a year, not anymore, but at the time it was $100 a year to get professional monitoring, decent amount of gear, cover all the recordings from all of my Ring cameras. Now, you've probably heard that there's some issues with law enforcement being able to access that just by requesting it. And the controls around that may be tighter, but there's also been some reports of just Amazon employees going and looking at footage whenever they want. So again, you've got to weigh the risks of these things, if you trust a particular company or not, and then also if you're not keeping your data, your video local, or any other data for that matter. If someone does break into your house, well, you've got footage of that in the cloud. So the benefits again can outweigh the DIY approach.
I was thinking of Ring as you were talking. So why wouldn't you put it on Home Assistant?
So I don't, just because it's a massive amount of data, video specifically, and if the house gets destroyed or robbed or whatever, that video would be gone or taken or destroyed. So it was really just a lot easier for me to say, here's $100 a year. I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
But you have internal cameras.
Correct. I don't have internal. Well, I don't have internal cloud dependent cameras. I do have some of those Wise cameras, but they're like behind my fridge watching for water leaks. Because I had a water leak there and I'm just paranoid now, or I've got one in the crawl space for the same reason, things like that.
So before I used to you, Amcrest makes cameras that can motion track and have night vision
Okay.
everything, and you can use Tuya to bring them into Home Assistant and do
Oh,
all
okay.
that locally. So I just went to Yellowstone, and while I was gone, they replaced the lock on my door, moving from a fob to a key. And I wanted to make sure that no one was moving through the home. So I actually fired all the cameras up. I've got 6 in the apartment. And so they will track motion and record. I have SD cards local there, and then they send to a NAS. But if I want to go through the app, I can't view it outside of my home.
Okay.
Unless I go through Tuya's app, and I have them set up to be able to do both.
Okay.
So while I was gone, I actually used the app, and from the app you can actually control the cameras and everything. But inside the home, through Home Assistant, it has a very similar interface where you can control the cameras as well.
Oh, okay. So like the pan and scan type stuff. Oh, okay. And that was Amcrest?
Amcrest.
Okay.
AMC,
Good to know.
exactly like it sounds, AMCREST. And they have different models you can do outdoors, but mine are internal dome cameras that you can mount on the wall, and they'll sit on like those shelves and stuff like that.
Okay.
And you can power over Ethernet, or you can plug them into the wall.
So you have no ability to see if one of us was in your house, though, right?
Well, I've got the perimeter.
But once
Monitor.
we're inside, once Pelfrey's inside,
I keep 2 sets of cameras, one external facing, the internal one facing ones. I only bring online when I'm gone. I just flip a switch, and now I can open up my Ring app and see everything in the house. Otherwise, if I'm home, they kick off. So,
Did skip over a bit on this last slide on risk appetite was redundancy. So you've done all this work, you've got all these IoT devices in your house. It makes life better to a degree, and then all of a sudden it doesn't, because you're using a Raspberry Pi with an SD card as its hard drive, and a power failure happened, and your SD card's now fried because it's constantly reading and writing to it. So now your entire smart home is down. In the old days, I had a spare SD card with a backup from a few weeks ago on it constantly. Nowadays, I use a Raspberry Pi 4, and I've got an SSD drive on it. So that's a lot more reliable in and of itself. But at like Costco or Walmart or Sam's Club, you can buy these little APC non-interruptible power supplies, or uninterruptible, however you say it. But those will power a Raspberry Pi, your internet modem, and your Wi-Fi router for hours. So you can still you can still monitor your smart home. All of your other devices are probably offline because of the power outage, but I strongly suggest getting some type of battery backup solution if you're going to do this.
Have you ever thought about using 2 Raspberry Pis with VRRP, something to keep it highly available? If one dies, it's the others won't take over.
I have not. The way the MQTT works with the subscription model, I'm sure it can be done, but it really complicates it.
Well, whichever is the main IP of your Raspberry Pi would move over to if the other one failed. So
Yeah, I don't know, because the state between the device and the hub, I don't know. Now I'm thinking through, maybe it would work
how many
more simply than I think.
all the other single points of failure? How much of this if you go all the way to the edge, right?
Right.
It's like the mechanic had over his toolbox. How fast can you afford to go?
Well, if nobody has any questions, I believe that's all that I had. I actually went a little over an hour, so I hope everyone enjoyed it. But yeah, I'm open for any more questions if you think of them later tonight.
We're definitely more cooperative.
Yeah, so if you guys could kind of help me police up the area a little bit, and try to leave this place cleaner than we found it. Thank you very much, Brian. And of course, no